I propose we get started slowly. We're still letting people in. Seems like the allow all button in Teams is struggling, so we need to go through them one by one. But I propose we get started, and people will still join in a second. So good morning from my side. Welcome to this webinar on the land sector removal standard, a new kid on the block in the greenhouse gas protocol library, so to speak. I'm very happy to be joined today by Catherine, who will do the heavy lifting. But before going to Catherine, let me first quickly introduce myself. So I'm Kenneth, co-founder and CEO of Carbon+Alt+Delete. For those who don't know Carbon+Alt+Delete yet, Carbon+Alt+Delete is a carbon accounting software provider, and our software is exclusively used by sustainability consultants across Europe. So we built a software, and together with sustainability consultant, we help companies measure and reduce their carbon footprint. Today, we work with around 200 consultancies across Europe to manage the carbon footprint of around 2,000 companies, Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. We also have embedded or implemented the land sector removal standard in our platform. I will say a couple of words on that towards the end of the webinar, but I'm very happy to be joined today by Catherine from Treekeel. Treekeel was a consultancy, was part of the technical working group when the LSRS was drafted, and I believe they also have been part in one of the pilot projects. But Catherine, feel free to introduce yourself a bit more to the audience.
Thanks, Kenneth, very much. Yes, so my name is Catherine McCosker. I am the head of agriculture and landscapes at Treekeel, which is a sustainability consultancy. I'll talk a little bit more about when I go into my talk, but I've been at Treekeel for about 12 years now. I have a background in agriculture. I'm a former farmer myself, and yeah, just very much looking forward to going to the LSRS with you.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Catherine, before we dive into the content, 2 words of let's say housekeeping rules. So we have a big group today, very happy with that. The downside is that spoken interaction is a bit more difficult, so it will be a one-way street from me and Catherine to you. But we strongly invite you to leave comments, leave questions in the chat. There is a Q&A chat in Teams. So on the top of your Teams window, you will see a Q&A icon. If you click on that, feel free to put your questions there. Also, feel free to upvote other questions that other people might have put there and that you like. Towards the end of the webinar, we have foreseen some time for a Q&A, and we then take the questions with most votes. I know from experience that those Q&A chat is not always working for everyone. If that's the case, also feel free to just put your questions in the regular chat. Your camera is switched off. You're muted by default. Apologies for that. Don't take it personal, but that's just the default team settings that we work with. I think in the meantime, every one of you has been able to join. For those who are just came in, my apologies. We had a bit of issues with admitting people to the webinar, but I think all of you now have joined right in time to go to the content. To position this webinar within other webinars that we organize. So I guess most of you have joined one of our previous webinars. Basically, what we try to do at Carbon+Alt+Delete is to organize 5-6 big webinars a year focused on carbon experts like yourself, and giving you an update on what's going on in the world of carbon accounting. And this year it's mainly about ongoing greenhouse gas protocol updates. So we did something on the Scope 2 guidance. We'll do something on the actions and market instruments towards the end of the year. And today we focus on the land sector removal standard, which is already final compared to the other updates the greenhouse gas protocol is working on. If you want to re-watch previous webinars, or if you want to subscribe for one of the next ones, everything is on our website. If you scan this QR code, you will get there, and we will also share the links with the debrief. Before I give Catherine the floor, it's always interesting for us to know a bit more who's in the call. Quick question, Mentimeter questions. You can go to menti.com, use this code or scan the QR code. But basically the question is, how familiar are you with the land sector removal standard? Are you new to this topic? Do you have a basic understanding? Have you already done some land-based emission inventories? Or do you consider yourself an expert? And you don't need to be too shy, right? So let me go here. Answers are still coming in, so I'll wait a couple of seconds. All right, I think answers are still coming in, but I think the trend is clear. So a big majority is relatively new to the topic. Let's say 40% new, 40% basic understanding, and 20% of the people with hands-on experience. And for the 1% experts in the call, I would invite them to actively contribute in the chat, ask their own questions or answer questions that other people might have, or share their own perspectives on where the complexities are. Strong invitation to, in particular, them to also participate and engage through the chat. With this, Catherine, happy to give you the floor, right? I think there is a lot of room for people to learn, right? What we see from the Mentimeter. So I'll give you the floor for the next 30 to 40 minutes. And then towards the end, I'll show you how we at Carbon+Alt+Delete have implemented LSRS in our platform. And we have some Q&A towards the end of the time, but some of you might know me. I might squeeze in some of your questions already during the presentation of Catherine. Catherine, I'll stop sharing and then the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Kenneth. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, all good.
Great. Okay. Right, so thanks again. So I'm going to start just very briefly by introducing, I've introduced myself, but introducing 3Keel a little bit. So particularly so that you can understand our background, our experience, and the perspective that we're bringing to the LSRS. So 3Keel is a UK-based sustainability consultancy, but we work in global supply chains, primarily in FMCG and natural resource supply chains, so quite a lot of land-based sectors. We are structured across 3 business units. We have significant climate expertise. We support organizations on understanding climate risk, setting net zero targets, developing decarbonization roadmaps, probably quite similar to a lot of the work that many of you do. We are global leaders on commodities and deforestation. So we manage large and complex programs that improve traceability in commodity supply chains. And we support on deforestation target setting and achievement. And then finally, the business unit that I lead has significant practical experience in agriculture and supply chains. I mentioned I'm a former farmer myself. So we bring everything else onto the ground and sort of into implementation. So once you've understood your risks, set your targets, or identified supply chains or landscapes of interest, how do you actually work in your supply chain to do something about it? How do you work on the ground in a way that you can reflect in your Scope 3 inventory, for example? And then we try and bring cross business unit expertise to everything that we do. We have deep experience, particularly in technical requirements and corporate reporting for FLAG and the LSRS in the land sector. We have a practical understanding of supply chains and the development of insetting scenarios and programs. Part of this is through a program that we've started called the Landscape Enterprise Networks, which is a landscape initiative, a sort of ecosystems market approach. We've done a number of projects for organizations like the UK government, Conservation International, around the best practice for insetting, essentially, within value chain mitigation. And we are the Secretariat for the Carbon Removals Task Force in the UK. Our perspective is very land land-based, land-focused. So we are primarily experts within the sectors that have significant land footprints. Oh, sorry. And so that means, as a result, our use of the LSRS and our perspective and interpretation of it is weighted in that direction. So this webinar will go deep on land management, biogenic and production emissions, land management, carbon removals, carbon dioxide removals. We won't go deep on technical removals. I'm not going to mention technical removals at all. And we won't go deep on biogenic product emissions, but we will touch on biofuels and implications for that. So I'll get started into the actual content now. So I thought it would be useful to start off with the wider context that the LSRS sits within. So I'm sure this is second nature to most of you, but for corporate climate targets, there are, of course, two key organizations that dictate the rules. First, you have the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which defines the rules for corporate greenhouse gas accounting and reporting. And then you have the Science Based Target Initiative, which defines target setting, scale of reductions and removals to be aligned with Paris goals. And they work together, right? They try to be aligned and they refer to each other. What we're talking about today, obviously, is the land sector and removals guidance, or standard rather, but it interacts directly with the science-based target standard, net zero standard, and particularly the FLAG target setting guidance. A little history to the LSRS. So the first draft came out in September 2022. So it's been a long road to get here. 4 years later, it was delayed a few times. It's a really complex subject matter, and it went through lengthy consultations. There was the technical working group that I mentioned my colleague Richard was a part of. They pilot tested it, reviewed it, and the final version was published in January of this year. In the original guidance, it was 2 documents. They had a sort of the part 1, which you can see up there, accounting and reporting requirements, and then there was a second bit that was the guidance. What they have done now is they have published the standard, which consolidates and focuses around 32 requirements, quite specifically on how to account for and report the greenhouse gas emissions and other metrics. And they've stripped out a lot of the additional detail that will be published in an additional sort of companion, the land sector removals guidance. That is due to be published in Q2 2026. We're obviously coming up to the end of that. So hopefully we'll be seeing that soon. It won't have additional requirements, but it will have hopefully quite a lot more information on how to apply those requirements in practice. And then it comes into force on the 1st of January 2027. That is the LSRS effective date. So what does it actually do? What is it trying to do? Alongside, of course, the detailed accounting guidance that it provides, it outlines several goals that it's trying to help organizations achieve. So that includes calculating land-based emissions and removals inventories, using those to identify hotspots and mitigation activities. What can you do on the ground to reduce your scope 3? Capture changes in inventory over time and report against climate targets. And then because of that, it also informs the developments of land-based mitigation target activities, including insetting and regenerative agriculture projects, which I will talk about a bit more later on. And it supports reporting and disclosure, being transparent about what you're doing. A lot of the companies that we work with are large food supply chain companies. And so this is a really key document for them when they have scope 3 targets where the agriculture emissions will be the significant majority part of their scope 3. This is a key document for how they can work on the ground to achieve those targets. So just a reporting overview. I think that many of you obviously will be working in probably almost entirely the physical inventory, so you're very familiar with that concept. In the LSRS, reporting is split into 2 categories. The physical inventory, which is the core emissions and removals numbers that align to greenhouse gas corporate reporting, the conventional corporate reporting. You can see that in sort of the top table of the graphic. And then it has a number of additional accounting categories, which includes a mixture of some emissions and then other novel metrics and new metrics that I will come on to. And they ask that you report this in a quote unquote greenhouse gas report, which is sort of the first time they've introduced this idea. And they recommend that it is assured the wider greenhouse gas report, although that is not required. And it's quite a big undertaking. They ask you to report a lot in the greenhouse gas report, but it also offers the opportunity to justify many of the decisions you've made. Because while the LSRS is quite long, there is still quite a lot of scope for interpretation and trying to understand what it actually means to report against certain metrics. One big thing to know about the LSRS is that it excludes forests from reporting in your physical inventory. This is an outstanding issue back from when the first draft came out. There was a specific advisory group, sort of subgroup looking at forests, and that group was unable to resolve the question of which emissions and removals associated with forests are anthropogenic and therefore should be captured in your physical inventory and which are natural. So as a result, they have just excluded reporting forestry in your physical inventory. They continue to look at it, but the sense that they give is it will be some time. So in the interim, they recommend that you report outside your physical inventory any activity in a transparent way. They introduced the concept of productive versus non-productive lands. So there is still some, I suppose, tree-based reporting required in your inventory on your productive lands, which can include some level of agroforestry, or obviously will include tree-based crops, fruits, nuts, that sort of thing. And you also still need to account for deforestation and conversion of natural forests, which will come through in your land use change emissions, land management production emissions due to activities on forest land, and any biomass carbon stock changes in productive lands. So that would be the agroforestry or the tree-based crops that I mentioned earlier. One of the most fundamental concepts in the LSRS is the idea or ideas around spatial boundaries and traceability. So these were introduced in the draft, and then they've been clarified and modified in this final version. So when you are doing land-based carbon accounting, it depends on defining a spatial boundary, which is the specific geographic land area included when a company accounts for its greenhouse gas emissions, removals, or other land-related metrics. So for Scope 3 reporting, and to agree, Scope 1, if it's including land, the boundary used is directly tied to the organization's level of physical traceability to the origin of products sourced. So this is a really big concept in the LSRS, and you'll see that it ends up, I think, driving much of what companies will need to do in order to be able to report these emissions and removals at the level that they might want to in order to capture impact of programs that they're running. So the LSRS outlines 5 spatial boundaries you can see there, from global, which is when you have no specific knowledge whatsoever of the origin of the products that you source, all the way to the harvested area boundary, which is literally the subplot or field of a farm or orchard, which was harvested to produce the product that you source. So a couple of the key things to draw out here. The LSRS updated the definition of a sourcing region from its original concept. The sourcing region, the definition of it is the first point of aggregation in a value chain or a supply chain. So that might be a palm oil mill, it might be a maize elevator, it might be a sort of wheat silo, or a dairy co-op. It has been expanded a little bit to include multiple first points of aggregation where they overlap. So that is a sourcing region. They've also updated the idea of a land management unit, which is essentially a farm business, a farm that is under one management plan, to include both productive areas of field, farms, so that's fields or grazing land, but also adjacent and proximate non-productive lands, which would be your hedgerows, your buffers, your woodland. So it wants you to incorporate that in the land management unit, but those adjacent and proximate lands, because they are included within the forestry exclusions, you cannot actually report them at this point in time in your physical inventory. I'll talk about the effects of that later. If you want to report removals, you have to have at least sourcing region traceability. I'm just looking at my slide, I'm not sure why it says LMU boundary. If you want to, I'll come on to the difference between LMU and sourcing region, but practically speaking, if you don't have land management unit traceability, it is difficult to report removals to capture the impact of a program that you're running rather than diluting it across a sourcing region. So the spatial boundary is crucial in summary because it determines the accounting approach. And for a given volume of product from a given area, you have to use the same spatial boundary for removals and for emissions reporting. Something else, yeah, so in order to justify the traceability that you have, you essentially have to prove your traceability. The LSRS doesn't introduce the concept, but brings in the concept of chain of custody models, which are commonly used in certain commodity certifications, or sorry, yeah, certification programs will use chain of custody systems. So basically, traceability refers to the ability to follow a product back to the farm or landscape where it's produced. So there are multiple ways to do this, but this is the way that's outlined in the LSRS. So they go into more detail here. And it outlines that some models are acceptable for traceability and some are not. So anything that maintains a physical relationship, which is identity preserved, segregated, things like that, where the product is actually physically segregated the whole way, it is definitely acceptable. You can also justify physical connectivity in certain types of mass balance systems where you have certain guide rails and safeguards, such as a defined reconciliation period. Mixing is restricted to sites within the same country and sourcing region, and you have to use proportional allocation for characteristics as they move through the supply chain. You can audit these and implement these either through certification routes or internal management systems. So it's a strong signal that basically you're going to need to develop some level of traceability if you want to accurately and capture and report the impact of your activities in your physical inventory. Finally, they do introduce the idea of impact traceability, but they haven't really defined what that is yet, and it would sit outside of your physical traceability. So that's maybe when you have you know where your activities are, which farms they're on, but you can't prove physical connectivity, so you can trace your impact back to those farms, and you're reasonably sure they're in your supply chain. That's probably why you're doing it. You don't have that physical traceability. You can still report that impact, but outside of your physical inventory. I'm going to go quickly through a few other key topics and updates, and I'll start with the ones that are relevant to the physical inventory. So the first one is land use change accounting. So for a long time, there was uncertainty around how to calculate and account for land use change emissions, given the tensions between carbon accounting rules, which require a 20-year time period, calculating over a 20-year time period, and certifications which have various cutoff years, which might be 20 or might be less than 20. So this provides clarity that you can't just assume that the certification zeroes out land use change. The time period has to match. And if the certification's cutoff period is less than 20 years, then you need to account for the remaining years to make up for it. They've also introduced a new accounting approach, which is jurisdictional direct land use change calculation. So previously there was either direct land use change calculation, you had to have quite detailed traceability to understand where you were sourcing from, or statistical land use change, which you took, the sort of best data regional average. And now there's the option, if you have traceability to a sourcing region, to be able to use essentially a sourcing region direct land use change calculation approach, which should be helpful to get higher quality impact data through the supply chain. The clarity here also improves the potential to reflect deforestation conversion-free policies and controls, such as certification in your GHG inventory, where that was unclear before. Biogenic product emissions, so they can still be reported outside of scope 1, outside of your physical inventory, but with new guardrails. So you can do that, for example, if the full biofuel life cycle greenhouse gases are reported and you calculate the leakage as well. Finally, on land management emissions, they confirm the stock change accounting approach, and there is clarity around requiring the separation of biogenic and production land management emissions. There are some recommendations around how you do allocation, or really, allocation across crop rotations, which is to allocate equally across using either area time or economic allocation, but that is a recommendation. It is not a requirement. There is also, as I mentioned, some new metrics that need to be reported outside of the physical inventory. I'm just going to cover a few of those. So one is land occupation and land carbon leakage. So these are two separate metrics. The first is a required metric for the total hectares of land occupancy, and they give some guidance on how you calculate that. So all of the land that makes up your supply chain footprint, essentially required to produce the crop or product that you source. And then there's a land carbon leakage reporting, where you have to essentially report on an assumption that your activities mean that land, food production or crop production or biofuel production has expanded because your activities have essentially reduced yield where you're working. So there are three things that trigger the requirement to report land carbon leakage. One is removals, conducting programs that are seeking removals. One is essentially activities that would be considered regenerative agriculture. And then one is production for biomass for biofuels. The first two, removals and regenerative agriculture, they require you to report if there is a significant reduction in yield. They don't define significant, so there's a little bit of justification there. And then they also say that you don't need to do that if you can essentially demonstrate that the activities are for the long-term sustainability of your supply chain. And given activities that result in removals and regenerative agriculture, that is the point of those. We think that metric, land carbon leakage, will be fairly straightforward to essentially justify why you don't need to report that. The outlier is biofuel, where that doesn't have a sort of, you can't sort of justify or argue that it's for the resilience of your supply chain. The required accounting methodology is laid out, and it's fairly conservative. It essentially assumes conversion of fully natural habitat into crop production. Finally, they do talk about greenhouse gas credits. They say that the only greenhouse gas credits created within the value chain or operations are in scope. So that's all that they're talking about when they give their guidance. If you have created greenhouse gas credits, or you are aware of them having been created in your supply chain, they ask you to report two inventories, one with the credits and one without, and to avoid double counting. They differentiate inset credits from greenhouse gas credits, and inset credits are not defined in the LSRS, but are defined in the sort of world of greenhouse gas protocol more broadly. But the guidance is due to provide more clarity on how they see them as different than greenhouse gas credits. They also have additional quality criteria for credit generation. So implications of the LSRS for science-based targets. There is, from January 2027, accounting needs to reflect land sector removal requirements, and this can potentially cause a discrepancy between methods that are used in your baseline and any follow-on footprints. Our view is that you only need to revalidate existing flag science-based targets if the application of the new LSRS requirements compromises your existing target. So you would have a different target based on a new base year inventory. So, for example, for flag sector pathway targets, where you're looking at an absolute percentage reduction, we think that's unlikely to be compromised because the new methods aren't likely to change the makeup of the activities that were included in the target pathway. But for commodity targets, where you're looking at an intensity reduction in intensity target, these are more likely to be compromised if the mix of removals and land use change is different in the base year. So for example, you have a target set to reduce maize emissions by 41%, and that was calculated by the SBTI tool based on the mix of land use change, land management, and removals emissions. But then you apply the LSRS's new requirements, and those new methods mean that the mix of emissions changes between those. Then your reduction target percent might change, e.g. it might be 38%, and then you might be looking at a revalidation. Implications for data sources. So I think the first thing that I would say, particularly if you're unfamiliar with reporting land-based carbon emissions, is that flag reporting is pretty limited if you can't get consumption-based activity data, e.g. kilograms procured. So our advice before getting into where to find emissions factors and where the good ones are and how to use them would be to focus on getting that physical activity data. That's sort of the bare minimum. We see that companies that go down the route of spend-based your sort of input output get a bit stuck, because then you can't align with the LSRS. And then you can estimate a footprint, but you're not going to be able to demonstrate any impact against that. Emissions factors. So the LSRS requires emissions to be split out by gas, and then also by biogenic carbon dioxide versus production emissions. And most emission factor databases for agricultural data don't yet do this, although they have generally indicated that they are working on it. The LSRS is quite new, so it will take them a little while to update. We use Agribelize, which is a publicly available data set. What we've done to get around this is that we've gone into the source data, which is public, that drives the overall emissions factor. And we have split the data into life cycles, which allows us to split out flag and non-flag. So we have our sort of accompanying database that we use. This is also in theory possible for EcoInvent, which is another common emissions factor database, but it's a much larger one. So for example, we only do it when we have to on a factor by factor basis. EcoInvent is used most widely, but because it's licensed, it is harder to share with clients. E.g., you can't share the underlying emissions factors with clients unless they also have a license, whereas Agribelize is free and open to the public. I'll go briefly into this. So often when I'm talking about the LSRS, I am talking to an audience who is doing a lot of regenerative agriculture programs or really working on the ground. So I'll touch on some of this, but I also don't want to get into an area that is not relevant for most of you. On the accounting side, which is probably the most relevant, the implications, I'm sort of zooming back a little bit and talking about the implications now of the LSRS and how you apply it. I just talked about how emissions factor databases now have a bit of catch up to do. That's true for farm greenhouse gas calculators as well. So in general, most people who are doing inventories interact with farm data via carbon calculators or those life cycle databases or specialist data sets that I mentioned. This is also true for land use change. So we recommend that you check in with your data providers, your farm carbon toolkit, to understand where they are and seek assurances that they are LSRS aligned. Everyone we know is sort of working quite hard at becoming LSRS aligned. So it's not if your provider is not, I wouldn't say it as a red flag. Just work with them to understand how they're working to get aligned, and where their gaps are, because this is going to be true for everyone as everyone sort of gets in place after it was published. And this is particularly true for sort of higher risk areas or more complex areas like trying to report removals or land use change, direct land use change. Regenerative practices, as I mentioned earlier, may trigger the requirement to calculate leakage emissions. So just paying attention to that, and understanding how you can maybe justify that around improving the long-term sustainability of food production. More broadly, some implications around implementation. I'll talk about removals next, but it does improve the feasibility of monitoring. But I mentioned that adjacent and proximate lands are excluded they've sort of been lumped in with the forestry exclusion, which is a potential perverse incentive for whole farm action, which is the kind of action you would want to drive for actual sort of supply chain resilience, a sort of whole farm system. So we're a little concerned about the potential perverse incentives there. Most of the removals that you're going to be able to, but many removals in a crop-based system will come from those edges, as well as the soil-based emissions or removals within your field. We are always recommending supply chain relationships and collaboration, which supports your ability to justify and demonstrate avoidance of double counting, which is a big emphasis for the LSRS. On traceability, the mass balance models and the clarity there does make it give us a lot of clarity on what traceability is and how you might be able to achieve it. There is a requirement when you are reporting at sourcing region boundary, which is the highest level boundary you can do to report removals, that you have to report and account for all attributable productive lands within that sourcing region. And that's because you do not have that traceability all the way to farms. You can't be sure which farms your product is coming from. You just know it's coming from that sourcing region. The impact of that is that if you are running a supply chain program or sourcing from certified farms in an area, and it's, you know, a smaller part of a large sourcing region. Some sourcing regions can be quite large. Because you have to account for the whole sourcing region, not just the farms that you're working on, it can dilute any impact that you might see through a lower emissions factor. So that's why, you know, whilst you can report removals at sourcing region, the reality is if they are big enough, it will be diluted to the point that you're not going to see much impact unless you have that traceability all the way to land management unit. So for many situations, in reality, you won't be able to report or see impact from your actions if you don't have that LMU traceability, and you can't set your boundary at that level. Just a couple more slides. So this is about removals more generally. So our experience is that lots of companies in food supply chains, natural resource supply chains, are conducting activities that are resulting in removals, but have not been reporting them because it is such a complex area and there hasn't been enough clarity. I would say after this publication, people are moving more confidently forward, but I think in many situations, reporting removals is still going to be too complicated, essentially, to be worth it, because of the complexity and the expense of proving traceability, and then also the MRV requirements, which I'll talk about just briefly here. So one of the requirements is that you have to demonstrate permanence. The way that they do that is they want you to, it's called ongoing storage monitoring. They want you to monitor in perpetuity, essentially, acknowledging that biogenic, which is our focus today, biogenic removals are always going to be less permanent than technical ones. That we're talking about a natural system. You cannot absolutely guarantee that the carbon will stay in the ground. So to work around that, or to acknowledge that, they ask that you monitor it. And that if there is a reversal, then you have to report that in future in your physical inventory. So they give more, the final draft has given more options for this, including buffer pools, where you can essentially hold some removals in reserve, and there are guardrails around that. And then monitoring periods, where rather than having to monitor it in perpetuity, you can plan a specific length of time that you're going to monitor it and then revisit it at that point. They differentiate reversals versus emissions. So if the removals or emissions are still within your supply chain in your inventory boundary, then you have to report them as emissions in that year that the reversal happened. If they aren't, so if the reason you're reporting it is essentially that your supply chain has shifted and those removals are no longer in your inventory, in your boundary, then you report that as a reversal outside of your physical inventory. I think those are the main things that I wanted to talk about with removals. I mentioned the emission of adjacent and proximate lands reduces the size of the opportunity, unfortunately. And again, there's a strong argument for more collaboration in management. The MRV required, which is not only the ongoing permanence, but also the data required and the modeling required, really adds up. If you're talking about soil, they want empirical data. And so that can also be a really big barrier, and collaborating can help reduce that and improve the efficiency there. So finally, just to talk about, where it goes in the future and other things that will shape the future of reporting in this space. So as I mentioned, we're expecting the guidance hopefully imminently, and that should clarify some of the outstanding questions we have about how you actually implement it. They also have the ongoing actions and market instrument working group, which I know that Kenneth has a webinar coming up in the autumn. And then, of course, the Corporate Net Zero Standard version 2 has just been released, and that offers some other interesting areas to think about in terms of reporting, such as ongoing emissions responsibility. And then FLAG, we do expect, obviously, is going to be updated now, but the timing of that is to be confirmed. And I think that's the last slide I had. So yeah, happy to turn back to you, Kenneth.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Catherine. Very, very interesting stuff. I see it based on the number of questions that come in. So that's typically a good sign. Maybe before I show you what we do at Carbon+Alt+Delete, already two practical ones. One is on the timeline. So you say effective as of January 2027. People are asking, does it then mean reporting in 2027 for 2026 data, or does it mean reporting for 2027 data as of probably 2028?
That is a good question. They do not clarify that.
Okay.
We have been recommending, so obviously most companies are going to be taking this next year to set up their data collection and reporting for 2027. So being ready in 2027 with 2026 data that is aligned is going to be difficult for many. We recommend you speak with your auditors, assuming you have them, on how they're going to look at this matter. But we think the most reasonable interpretation is that you start reporting 2027 data forward has to be aligned with the LSRS.
Okay, that's it is what it is. Not I think the clear answer that everyone was hoping for, but
I'm that's a
it's not their
trend here,
fault.
I'm afraid.
Exactly. And maybe a second question. I'm not sure if there was a very clear answer to that. I know on the initial guidance there was no clear cutoff, like because it focuses on companies in the food and agricultural sector. But okay, I think a lot of companies sometimes even buy catering, so technically are part of the food and agricultural. Supply chain. Is there kind of a cutoff as of which you basically don't need to report land emissions if they're under a certain threshold, or is that not being specified in the land site removal standard?
So I don't think the LSRS would be the guidance for that. I think that would be the flag or corporate net zero, which is about how you set your targets, right, and what you can exclude and exclude. The LSRS will just talk about how you actually account for them if you have to include them.
Okay. So that's, and then the flags about target setting. Our understanding from the guidance was that indeed they did, if they don't specify in the LSRS a cutoff rate, you fall back on the corporate standard, where they also don't really have a cutoff rate as of which you don't need to report on specific scope 3 aspects. They do have some guidance, but I think somewhere they have the beautiful statement in an additional guidance on the corporate or the scope 3 standard that you need to prove that it's below 1%, but if you, by proving it, you need to measure it anyhow, so then why not include it, right? And that's of course kind of a circle reasoning. Very good. Before we go to the other questions in the Q&A, and I would invite people to still put their questions in the Q&A and upvote, let me show you in a couple of minutes what we do at Carbon+Alt+Delete. Let me share my screen again. So of course, we're also, we have implemented the LSRS. I need to be careful here. So I will show you in a minute what we do on LSRS. We have implemented over the course of 2025 land-based emission reporting based on LSRG, right? So the guidance that came out. We are now refining details to make it in line with the LSRS. 90% from a data model perspective is the same. It's mainly about what you add and the exact terminology where some details have changed. Before showing you the platform, another remark is that the details of land-based reporting are pretty complex, and you can get very quickly lost in some rabbit holes on technical complexities. But overall, I'm relatively optimistic that for a lot of companies, it will go smoother than they currently expect, right? Knowing that you still need to collect activity data, depending a bit on where you are in the supply chain. But if you're, let's say, halfway and you're buying vegetables, you're buying meat to process it into a meal or salads that you sell, you don't need additional activity data to be collected, right? Also for your fossil carbon footprint, you need to know then how many chicken meat you already procure. So in terms of data collection, no additional work there. It's different if you're really owning a lot of land, if you're very early in the supply chain, right? Then I think you need to have, then you need to have more data on the land and how you manage it. And then in the second step, it's up to model providers, software providers like ourselves to update their carbon accounting engine with this land-based component. And it's also up to emission factor databases to provide the granular emission factor data that you need, right? As Catherine pointed out, we're living in a moving world. Things are relatively new. So we are updating the carbon accounting engine, and Catherine also mentioned the emission factor databases, that they are not yet fully there, but they're moving in the right direction. But assuming that companies like Carbon+Delete, emission factor databases like EcoInvent do their homework, then for a lot of those companies, over the course of 2027, land-based reporting will go, I believe, relatively smoothly. And the main challenge might be in explaining them what it means and how they can act with it, right? And that's then, I think, the role of the many carbon consultants here in this call. So very quickly, let me show you in Carbon+Delete how it works. So I'm now logged in, where you see if you log in a classical dashboard, but we have a fossil dashboard, so with all fossil emissions. We have a land based dashboard with all land emissions and land removals. And we also have a gross biogenic emission dashboard with all gross biogenic emissions, so emissions mainly coming from biofuels and biomass. What's behind this are detailed data points in our greenhouse gas inventory. So let me show you an example for goods and services, where I have here an example of a banana production, where I have 100 tons of bananas using an EcoInvent emission factor. I use EcoInvent 3.11 in here. We also have 3.12, but for just this example uses 3.11. The emissions here on top that we calculate are the fossil emissions linked to the 100 tons of bananas that you procure. If you zoom in on a breakdown by greenhouse gases, you get the splits over the different greenhouse gases and over the different types of emissions, fossil, land, and gross, also removals from land. You can zoom in further on the land emissions, where we split the land emissions further in land use change, land management, and land undefined. That's still currently what we need to make our data model work. It's an undefined button to map emission factor databases to our data model. And what's behind this in terms of emission factors are a broad set of databases. Agri-Balize was mentioned in the scope of this webinar. We also have EcoInvent. We also have REP, another food-based emission factor database. And as of July 1st, we will also have Agri-Footprint as an additional database in Carbon+Delete with very detailed land-based data, including the split for flag. Right, so they have a flag-specific database. Final thing here that I want to show, just to show you the level of detail that we facilitate. So you can also define your own emission factors in Carbon+Delete, and you can do it with all the level of detail that you need. So this is just an empty emission factor, but just to show you the level of detail. So you have the different life cycles. Combustion, or is it indirect generation, T&D. You have the different types of emissions, fossil, land use change, land management, land undefined, gross biogenic, and then the same for removals. And then you have the split over the different greenhouse gases, right? So if you want to define it very much in detail, you need to look at a lot of different dimensions, but that's the level of detail in which emission factors and corresponding emission data points are being modeled in our data model. Then the final thing I want to show is then also a report. So we have predefined reports, including a greenhouse gas protocol report that includes all the necessary information required by the greenhouse gas protocol, organizational boundaries, operational boundaries, fossil inventory. And then in the back, as an appendix, we show the standardized tables in line with the greenhouse gas protocol activities for the fossil emissions, also for the land emissions with the different categories of land. So that's the physical inventory as required by the land sector removal standard. Same for removals. And then we have the gross biogenic emissions and removals as an additional table, as this is not part of the physical inventory, but rather an additional accounting category according to the land sector standard, land sector removal standard. So this is in a nutshell how we have implemented, as said, based on the land sector removal guidance. The data model, which was quite a bit of work to update, has not changed. It's still valid for the landscape removal standard. What we're now reviewing and updating is some of the exact terminology and splits that we use here, right? Of grouping them up to the different categories in the physical inventory. So with this, let me stop here. And let me go to the Q&A for the final 7 minutes that we have. Let me have a quick look at the Q&A chat to see what questions mostly came in. Let me sort them. I'm upvoted, right? So 17 votes for a question on emission factor databases, Catherine. Any recommendation for database emission factors that cover the required data and ensure compliance with LSRS standard and science-based target flag requirements? You have already partially answered that question, so I'm not sure if you want to add something to what you said before.
No, I mean, our understanding is that there's no list of like databases that are fully LSRS aligned, and most of them are still aligning given the release only just this year. So the two most commonly used that Kenneth mentioned are EcoInvent and AgriBelize. My understanding is they are still aligning, but you cannot go into their source data and do the split manually, essentially. So they just don't provide the emissions factor like sort of pre-split out. But I think that that's the direction that they're moving in.
Okay, that's very clear. We answered the question on the timelines. A question from Che. If there is a meat production company, how should they take into account agricultural boundaries related to animal feeding? And how will they have scope 3 based on scope 3 CO2 emissions based on that?
So your livestock feed would be a purchased input and it would have an emissions factor, and that emissions factor either you can look to work with your supplier, or maybe they will have sort of done the work with primary data in order to have essentially it just depends on the data that you have for your purchased feed or the data that the supplier has. It may be that you need to use a more generic higher boundary for that emissions factor, in which case your land use change may be higher. It will be incorporated all together in that emissions factor essentially. But feed can be a significant part of a footprint for a meat producer in the UK or Europe, particularly because many of them will be feeding on soy feed imported from Brazil, for example.
That's clear. Thanks a lot for that. And there is a question from Elisa on removals, right? So she would like, I think the question is oriented at you, Catherine. Appreciate your opinion on the following when addressing land management CO2 removals. I understand that if someone chooses to report for removals, the LSRS requires emissions and removals to be reported separately. But if the net land carbon stock change increases, is it acceptable to use a netting approach for a material product carbon footprint? So emissions minus removals. So I think it's a question about net versus gross, right? How do you need to split up if you have a combined effect of gross emissions and gross removals?
Sorry, just to make sure I understand the question. So you have emissions and removals. In this scenario, the emissions are higher than the removals? I suppose it doesn't really matter. I'm just getting it straight in my head.
Yeah, so I think the examples she mentioned is a net removal consisting of gross emissions and gross removals happening both in scope 1 on owned land or managed land.
Yeah, so they do require you to report them separately, but then my understanding is you can net them, assuming the removals are higher than the emissions, but you should have two separate lines on your inventory essentially.
Yeah. So you should always, so I'll try to summarize to make sure I understand you correctly, Catherine. So look at removals and emissions separately, report them as gross, and then there is a place where you can add them, but the total is put under an additional accounting category, right?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. Which, and that's more my personal opinion. I know it's additional work, but I think it makes sense because if you have a net removal of 2 ton, and it's basically the same as a gross removal of 2 ton, or it's the combination effect of +5 -7. What you want to do with it, or the actions you want to take, or the advice you want to give to that company is probably completely different in the two scenarios, right? So I think to have the additional insight, it makes sense to split them up. Maybe just a final question also in the interest of time. Again, on removals from Bert. If I understand it, if you can demonstrate your removals on the approved spatial detail, you are allowed to vertically cascade them according to LSRS. But those removals are not allowed to be vertically cascaded according to the science-based target. So the question is basically, is his interpretation correct?
That's a good question. So I am less familiar on SBTI and flag reporting. It's my colleagues that deal with that, so I can come back to you to make sure that this is correct. But the LSRS interpretation is correct. You can vertically cascade essentially through your scope 3, because essentially, if you're watching a product move through from, say, the mill to the manufacturer, say it's Cargill, splitting wheat, up to Nestle, the emissions are part of all of their inventories. They're part of all of their scope 3 boundaries. And so in that sense, you can cascade it up. You're all reporting on the same emissions, and that is allowed, or removals. You can't do that sort of horizontally, of course, but you can do that vertically if you can prove that traceability.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. In the interest of time, I propose we stop here. I know we have not been able to address all questions. Over the coming days, we will share the slides and the recordings, including our contact details. So I would invite you to feel free to reach out to me and or Catherine if you have follow-up questions. Before I let you go, one more word on the upcoming webinars we organize. So after summer, in September, we have a speaker from the Science-Based Target talking about the Science-Based Target Net Zero Standard. So maybe we should ask the same question we ended with also then to that person. And towards the end of the year, we'll zoom in on the corporate standard. Speaker still to be confirmed. So with that, thanks a lot to all of you for joining and for your questions and the interaction through the chat. Thanks a lot to you, Catherine, for sharing your expertise. Based on a number of questions, I derived that it has been highly valued and a lot of people have learned a lot of things. So thanks a lot, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.